You good to go? Hi, Matt Sitter here, CEO of AFN. Our fundamental belief at AFN is that change is where opportunity happens. And the best way to find opportunity in change is a network that is diverse in experience, expertise, and perspective. That's one of the reasons why we bring subject matter experts to our membership to talk about the things that are important for us as we are considering what to do with our organizations and how best to operate them. Today, we've got with us Tom Bradbury. Tom is CEO of a company called Broadgauge, author of The Culture Project, longtime entrepreneur, and fascinated by culture. Tom, awesome to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Matt. As always, I enjoy talking to you and being a part of these.
So the main topic that we're focused on today is around culture. When we're thinking about our organizations, retention and engagement, those are key strategic advantages for us to be able to have there. Part of the implication around that is, how do we think about culture as an organizing principle? How do we measure, monitor, and impact culture? Tom, the best way that I've ever heard culture described, and I'm sure you got your own definition, is that's just the way things are around here. How do you describe culture, and how does that impact how you think about how we should be monitoring and measuring it?
Yeah, it's a great question, because as you and I were talking about when we first jumped on the call a little bit before going live, per se, culture is a very personal thing, right? Like there's a little interpretation and everyone has their flavor. And many people bring a lot of smart perspectives to that. I distill it down to shared values and appropriate behaviors, right, within an organization. And I think if we start there, you really can think of foundationally, what does that mean within any given organization, and how do we understand if we have shared values and appropriate behaviors like in common across the organization. That's paramount. So yeah, that's our simplistic approach to how we define or look at culture.
Okay, so perfect segue, because shared values, appropriate behaviors, pretty qualitative. How should we be thinking about measuring them? How can we even measure them and think about that for our organizations?
Well, I'd first say that like you talked about engagement and attrition, meaning you used the word engagement in a way that was separate from culture, right? And I concur with that. I think engagement's super important, but engagement is not culture. It's part of culture. So we have to think about culture more a combination of things, right? Like, for example, in our model, we have 4 dimensions of culture: leadership, organization, which is largely policies and values, right? Okay. The workforce and how they're trained, reviewed, communicated with. And our 4th dimension is technology, right? To understand how the technology is in place or not, and how it helps us be productive and communicate. So when we look at those and understand what's acceptable, we really take like an organizational effectiveness approach to each of those 4 dimensions and across all 4, and kind of create a profile. And because what we think about is wherever there's ineffectiveness, that's because your culture tolerates that ineffectiveness, right? So, and if you're tolerating that ineffectiveness, it's because your values of the company, or the values of the company, are not translating to any area or specific policy, as an example, or like the behavior, the appropriate behavior that you want to be taking within your business. So offering these profiles back across those 4 dimensions really helps you understand what your company is tolerating where, right? Where the root cause of culture, issues in and around culture are kind of showing themselves.
Right. My colleague John is fond of talking about, whatever you're willing to tolerate is the standard. So if you said something the standard, but you're actually willing to tolerate something less than the standard, that actually is the standard that you're
That's
you're
culture,
thinking about.
right? Your culture is how much of that are you willing to accept or turn a blind eye to?
So I would say, the complications around culture have grown a lot. If we thought about everyone being in the same place at the same time, it probably culture reinforcement, this idea of ensuring that you have shared values, that behavior is somewhat consistent. You're seeing it more often. Hybrid work, remote work is becoming a lot more common. How is this changing how we consider culture, and how is it changing how we should be impacting it in your mind?
So if you asked most leaders, right, or all leaders or a bunch of leaders, close your eyes and tell me what culture looks like, the overwhelming majority of the time, they're going to see people together, working together, right? They're going to envision people, for lack of a description, in a workplace, working together and being productive, right? So the challenge now is, to your point, with hybrid and remote work, culture is the new workplace, right? Culture is now this fabric that connects your workforce to the business and each other, no matter where people are. So this new fabric really has to be paid attention to and, constantly, recalibrated or calibrated. I love the saying that desired state culture is not a destination, it's just a continuous journey, right? So you have to be working on that. And what we believe to be true is, and more important than ever before, is that the data that you provide leaders has to get them the ability to better influence decisions around culture throughout the workforce, right? So it's super, super important that they're given data that's more business centric, relatable, and understandable. And I really started Broad Gauge based on that being our North Star. How do we deliver data to leaders that's relatable to them? Because I do think, I think HR is a highly important function within any business. I think employee engagement is, paramount to be paying attention to. But I tend to see the data that comes out of that more HR oriented than macro business oriented. Okay. That really helps executives be closer to that decision, their ability to influence decision making with the macro business view, in mind. So that's what we think is paramount.
What's an example of some of the things that, if you're thinking about from the macro business view and thinking about culture through that lens, what's some of the examples that you would use, maybe in terms of metrics that you consider against it, or terminology that you use, or how you structure your thoughts?
Our thoughts, or our thoughts with a client?
Helping, if you're trying to make this real for executives out there who are outside of their HR function, how are you doing it?
Well, there are very similar mechanics to a component of what we do, which is similar mechanics to employee engagement, right? We sign up clients on an annual basis. We consider ourselves a managed service provider, measuring culture and monitoring its impact on the bottom line. So what that means is a couple of times a year, maybe more if there's some real transformational events or work being done, but twice a year we're running surveys that are more org effective driven rather than questions in a survey that talk how do you feel kind of stuff, for lack of a better description. And we're providing that data back with my 4 dimensions and profiles that are super understandable. I can explain it to a board of director. From a governance perspective, we can use the same data for governance that boards of directors can relate to. CEOs in the C-suite can think about strategy and how to partner with operators in the business to take action. And then it's highly actionable all the way down to the manager level. So the same terminology, the same approach, but it just informs each layer of a business given their function and importance of each function. So we drive it that way helping them understand where they need to address culture issues, considering that variety of needs across any given workforce. So you're talking about a department or a tenure within a department or a generation from across the company. So just being able to calibrate and provide culture profiles, again, with data behind it, that can be actionable or understandable is what are some of the main pillars of how we approach it.
How engaged are employees in this process? And I would say, like, what's a benchmark of, like, what's our expectation of, you're putting out a survey to folks. How much of the population is replying to that, so you're getting an idea of what's going on? What's a good...
That varies client by client. So, we've had clients kind of pull people into the lower end of acceptability with like a low 50s% response rate, right?
Yeah.
We've had clients in the 90% percentile, right? And there are a bunch of different factors to that, but you could start with the fact that that's an indicator in itself. So if someone's at 52, 53%, go forward, it'll be important to explain what we learned from the process, show action and investment based on what we learned, and do things like that and communicate them back to the employees so that they understand that what they're providing, right, the data they're providing back in that sentiment data, anonymous data, is having an impact. And then you're going to raise that response rate up. And again, that's kind of the first indicator of in and around engagement. But other than the surveys, I should mention what we also do is on a quarterly basis, whether we're doing a survey or not, we're giving an analysis of their attrition quarter by quarter.
Okay.
So talking about, X% attrition rate annualized. And then, of course, what's the breakdown of that, right? What's the millennial attrition rate versus Gen X attrition rate, right? So we're providing that analysis so that we can see, right, the impact of what we're learning via the surveys and the actions and investments we're making. We can see the impact on turnover. And we're also calculating these specialized human capital financial metrics on a quarterly basis. So every quarter, no matter whether we're surveying or not, a company or a client is giving us financial data, the financial data we need to calculate these specialized financial indicators, as well as that attrition. And one of the financial indicators is often cost of attrition. How much is that attrition costing the business when you factor in loss of productivity? So we're doing that on a quarterly basis, and then every other quarter, providing this survey to the employees, getting this data back, organizing the data, and really understanding what needs to be addressed where in the organization. And kind of as you monitor those financial indicators and the turnover on a quarterly basis, what kind of impact are we having? So getting back to maybe an early question, right, using those relatable culture metrics, right, to give really that relatable data back to them based on the sentiment, we're also trying to address this, why should they care, right? They should care because it has an impact on the bottom line as well.
Yeah, no, I think that that is what is needed on the culture side, is saying, hey, what are the tangible outcomes that we're actually trying to achieve? There's a reason why we got the organization together. What are we actually trying to get done here? Gearing it towards that, it's useful. You talked about segmenting around.
Real quick, those financial indicators are really important, and they're not proprietary to us. They're these specialized metrics that ISO, World Economic Forum, support. So they're legitimate.
So we're approaching some standards around that type of stuff.
Yes, absolutely.
I want to, before we go in, I want to ask you about the segmentation, because you talked about generationally. Before we hit that, so you talked about ISO, et cetera. We're starting to see standards emerging around that. When we think about this from a regulatory perspective, and we do have some international folks that are on today, and our audience is international in AFN. But some of the examples that you're seeing in the US of regulatory impact around culture would be useful for us to hear about too. So what are you seeing around that?
Yeah, and we're starting to do some work internationally and understanding what's different where and the realities of doing this work, right? And the impact of more localized, to different countries, Europe and whatnot. But here in the US, in 2020, the SEC first introduced some human capital regulations. They had these 9 areas of human capital where they said that these publicly traded companies needed to report on anything or disclose anything, quote unquote, of material. Not a lot of guidance on how they should be reporting, what kind of data they should be using, et cetera, et cetera. But it's start where you are kind of stuff, right? So that is evolving, and over the coming months, there's going to be more structure that the SEC's Investment Advisory Committee made recommendations on, and the SEC decided that they're going to kind of add to the disclosure requirements for a little bit more rigidity. But that's having an impact. So you have these really smart investors like pension fund managers, benefit fund managers who are investing in companies that they're aware of this. And if you look back, and this is really cool graph I can share with you, Matt, I'll email it to you later, where it talks like late 70s, early 80s across the S&P 500, assets were comprised of 90% tangible, 10% intangible assets across the S&P 500. Today, that has completely flipped, right? Intangible assets make up 90% of a firm's assets.
Okay.
And what is that based on? People, knowledge, IP, experience, et cetera, et cetera. So these really sophisticated investors understand that if they're making an investment based on the pension funds, a union membership or whatever it might be, they need to understand, is the workforce being invested in, and is it stable? They want that data. And that's starting to influence what investors want in, not publicly traded arena, i.e. private equity fund, for example. You have LPs who are saying, I want this data, right? I'm the same person. We're the same entity investing in these publicly traded companies. We know what to ask for and what's really important. If we're going to give you $300, $400, $500 million for this fund, can you tell us what kind of data you have around the workforce in these assets within any given fund, right? So it's starting to kind of permeate the thinking, and officially it probably goes certainly gaining steam and some depth to it, but you could see it's gonna permeate even further.
Right. Well, what I know for sure is the big investors that are out there, if they can model something, they will do it. And so if you're giving them more data, they're actually going to put it to use. So I do think it's interesting from the perspective of, hey, like how are people thinking about investing related to this? Clearly going to have a bigger impact.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be, management team and key man, key woman, understanding where there was risk. And, then of course, diversity initiatives and what kind of play is there. But it's starting to the sophisticated investors are starting to see it more. They want to see it more, in aggregate across the entire workforce, right? Because that's also when a workforce's culture is a positive one, right? That's where you're going to generate, future leaders up and through the ranks, that internal mobility so that if someone leaves, you have someone that knows the culture and can fill in. Because as you know, to go out and if you're, in any given industry and you're owned by private equity and a key person leaves, a lot of times it can be very expensive to replace someone on the management team, right? And it's always a risk. It's a change. It's something new. So smart investors see not just that one member of the management team or any given member, but also the workforce throughout any given entity.
For going back to something we were talking about earlier, so I think it's really easy for us to think about organizations as one organization, to think about culture as being monolithic. You described segmenting generationally how people are viewing culture. How else are you looking at segmenting culture to identify pockets of where things are different within an organization for maybe point level interventions around it? How else do you think about how we should be dividing things up?
So I would say they're across clients. We see, certain filters, we call them where we apply filters so that we can sort the sentiment data and really drill down. There are a few to a handful that are more universal, tenure, generation, and then there are other ones that are specific to an industry or even a company that's really important. So, for example, we work with a healthcare company that was getting crushed coming out of the pandemic and turnover. It was really department by department. They were one location. We helped them understand what kind of impact the turnover was having on their bottom line, right? So then you're starting to look at the departments that were more revenue impactful, right? Above average impact on revenue. And, what could we look at there? So it's department by department. And, by drilling down, we really saw in the second year of tenure, how the culture scores plummeted, right? And that's where they were kind of experiencing that turnover, right? As opposed to a national real estate company that we worked with that had, by all measures, a very good to excellent culture. We triangulate with ENPS, Employee Net Promoter Score, which is something we track alongside of our culture data and kind of cross-reference. But so these folks it was less about departments and more about the markets, right? As you might imagine in real estate, you're hiring people with local knowledge, local relationships, and local clients for the long haul, right? So for them, it was less about departments and saying, let me look at the Atlanta market versus the Dallas market versus the New York market, and really seeing the different needs, like visually, like with our reports, you can pick up really quickly how this market had learned some things, shall we say, in these specific areas of the culture versus that market, and how the CEO and the president were meeting with the market leadership teams with their given reports to talk about the actions and thoughts that they were going to bring to the table to work on it. So Getting back to your question, right? There are some important factors. So millennials are leaving at a clip, right? Like many businesses, most industries have to obviously keep that in mind, like a generational factor. But then it's, business by business or industry by industry. And, some of the things that are more traditional, right? Like in real estate, how are we holding on to our successful female brokers, right? Which across the real estate industry has been a challenge, right? And a more male dominated, traditionally speaking industry. And so they want to bring what do we have to do different to support a culture that attracts and keeps successful women in our business?
So one of the cool things about what you're doing is you're getting to look under the hood of a lot of different organizations. Is there anything that is surprising that you're finding to be a trend as as you've been getting into this, as you've been building your organization, as you guys have been having more success? Is there anything you're like, I didn't expect this to be going on? Any trend that you're seeing?
I think, millennials, right? What's
Okay.
interesting, a lot of times we'll receive data that's not exactly negative, right? So there's this kind of, you know, the millennials a lot of time, oftentimes are an enigma, right? In traditional ways of looking at it, where the data's not bad, it's just they're saying, oh no, everything's okay. It just wasn't for me, right? Like, so,
Okay. Right.
that's something that we've seen a little bit consistently. Um, one of the biggest things that, data can always help you see something a little different, right? So this idea of using ENPS to help kind of triangulate, with different data points. So the realization, and we see this in the data, right? In the math of the data. It's not quite what you're asking, but it's a really important component that we've learned over our last few engagements. And that is ENPS can put you at a very good to excellent culture. Our culture metrics will come back to support that, of course, right? You'll be able to say, oh, they have a 41 or a 42 ENPS, and their culture data is coming back. They're balanced in all four dimensions, so it's healthy, it's positive, very good to excellent. We've created a filter so that we can look at the culture data through the lens of ENPS. So if you understand ENPS, if you're 0 to 6, you're a detractor. If you're a 7 or 8, you're passive. 9 or 10 is a promoter. So what we do is we go and say, show me the culture profile of the passives and the detractors. Like, let's take all the high marks out and just look at it. And as you might imagine, the scores can be quite negative. And even in a culture by all measurements that's very good to excellent, that data that came back really negative across detractors and passives represented 44% of the respondents. So if you just think about what's under the surface, right? 44% of the company of a culture that's very good to excellent, was super negative, right? Like just looking at that, and that just kind of, really highlights why people have to keep looking at this, right? And how quickly things could change if you don't understand it and continuously work on it.
I got one more question for you. The implication of monitoring, measuring is that you can intervene and you can do something about it, right? So like I'm down in San Diego right now, it's raining a lot. If I'm looking at the weather, that means I'm going to wear a rain jacket. What are some of the interventions that companies are doing? And just maybe one example of, hey, we're seeing in this segment that we're weaker than where we should be. What are folks doing to help correct that?
Once they think about the response rate, well, I mentioned it already, a big step that really helps CEOs kind of crystallize their thoughts on how they need to be sharing this data and communicating it back holistically is huge, right? And that's, people would say that about employee engagement or most anything else, right? Around learning it. So that still is paramount, right? Some of the more specific things we're learning, like the healthcare company that I mentioned that was losing 48% a year of their most revenue impactful department, right? The front line. They were comprised mostly of early career, first job kind of folks. And I remember the CEO saying to me, up front, just qualitatively, he knew he had, obviously there's a lot of turnover. He's saying, we're like the Navy SEALs. We come in, it's a really tough job. And then when people leave, they get an easier job and get paid more money, right? And when the data came back where we really showed what was happening in the second year of tenure of those folks, they designed a program to address that, right? Because we also showed them, look, save 5 more people, and you can send up to $2.5–3 million back to the bottom line. How much of that $2.5–3 million, based on the financial indicators we were working with them on a quarterly basis, how much of that would you invest to get the rest back to the bottom line and work on stemming that attrition? So they really started to build a program that has stabilized it, and we're meeting with them in a couple of weeks to kind of get the final numbers on that. So
no, that's great. You're giving them the logic to be able to pay for itself. So that's
totally. And data. So what you think you understand qualitatively, when you use data in the right way, it gets a lot more specific and helps you take action.
Awesome. Well, thanks a ton, Tom. Great conversation. Really appreciate it. The recording will be available for our folks that are out there. So looking forward to having other people check out what we talked about today.
Great. Thanks.